és Júriim, kellemes jó estét kívánok. Anybody speak Hungarian here? You do. How did I do? Pretty good. What I was hoping to say was, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good evening to you. Although knowing the guy who taught me how to say that, I was afraid I was going to say, ladies and gentlemen, my hovercraft is full of yields or something. In any event, it is a great pleasure to see you all again. My past trips to Menlo have always been the high points of my summer, and I feel the same way again, and it is just such a pleasure to be back here at this rarefied music festival. So thank you, David and Wuhan, again for inviting me back, and wonderful to see you all again. This encounter will be a bit of an appetizer for Tuesday evening's concert, which is entitled Hungarica. And over the course of this 2-hour event, the first 45 minutes will trace the development of 18th and 19th century Hungarian gypsy-derived exoticism. And when we come back from our break, the second part will talk about 20th century Hungarian folk-derived modernism at the hands of Bartók and Kodály. So much to talk about tonight. This desire to evoke an exotic cultural other in musical terms was not the exclusive domain of 18th and 19th century composers, of course, but there was this very enduring style of exoticism known as the style Hongrois, which began at the time of Haydn, went through Schubert, went through Brahms and Liszt, and it petered out around the turn of the 20th century. This Hungarian style of exoticism was preceded by another kind of exoticism, which was called the Turkish style. And it was an outgrowth of various Ottoman incursions into Western Europe, culminating in 1683 with the siege of Vienna. And a part of this battle regimen of the Janissary armies was that they played battle music. And the music was apparently very noisy, and it was intended to frighten the people within the town walls of Vienna and to stoke the Ottoman fighting spirit. And apparently did all of the above. And the music was characterized by simple trumpets, which produced 1 or 2 notes and must have sounded like blaring vuvuzelas, and also a whole variety of percussion instruments, mostly cymbals and drums. And this din, this racket associated with the siege of 1683 lingered in the popular European imagination for the better part of a century afterwards, and turned up in the percussion parts to classical symphonies by composers such as Haydn, where it was called the Turkish battery. So the Turks were this exotic cultural other during the 18th century, and as such, they were not understood very well by the Europeans at large, and they were generally looked down upon, and they were parodied shamelessly in the literature, and particularly in the operas of the day. And your standard Turkish-style opera plot revolves around abducted European females who are in the possession of loutish Turks, and the object is to subjugate them to harem submissiveness, and always with comical results. And the typical operatic Turkish-style plot is that of the abduction from the Seraglio, which Mozart wrote in 1782. And it has just such a scenario. You have Constanza, who is an upper-class English woman, and her plucky and dominable maid, whose name is Blondie. And they have been abducted by pirates at sea. They have been sold to Pasha Zalem. And his overseer, who is this brutish, Bluto-like lout named Osman, has become fascinated by Blondie, but he's also outraged by her unseemly English assertiveness.
Lasst euren Wein an den Vieh.
So we see Osman is a cartoon. And the general attitude towards the Turks was that they were buffoons and that their music was the exact opposite of European finesse and elegance. It was like that excerpt I just played from the Military Symphony of Haydn. It was percussive, it was full of jangling cymbals and beating drums and simple 2/4 meters and all kinds of obsessive repeated notes. And we hear that earlier in that same opera at the arrival of Pasha Zelim at his palace in the company of his unwilling consort Constanza. This Turkish style really took hold. There was a rage for it to the point where people wanted to be able to evoke it in their own parlors and living rooms on their home entertainment systems of the day. And so people began to develop what were known as Turkish stop pianos. Anybody hear of a Turkish stop piano? It was a piano equipped with up to 6 pedals, and you could depress them to activate all kinds of Turkish stop, Turkish battery percussive devices. For the 18th century teenager who wants to torment his parents. My Turkish stop piano goes up to 11, that kind of thing. Anyway, this style of Turkish music began to lose its appeal around the turn of the 19th century, and this portrayal of the Turks as this exotic cultural other was given over to another group of exotic cultural others, and these were the Hungarian Romani people. Like the Turks before them, they were misunderstood, they were looked down upon, they were often persecuted. They were not allowed to make a living in a conventional way, and so they gravitated toward being itinerant tradesmen and also itinerant entertainers and musicians. And this dovetailed rather well with the prevailing attitudes in Hungary toward music making, which were that if you were a member of the upper classes, if you were a nobleman, or if you were a member of the upper bourgeois gentry, it was all right if you wanted to write a piece of music. It was not all right if you wanted to play it in public. This was considered to be beneath your station. And so that left a void, and the Hungarian Romani people rose to the upper echelons of the musical society to fill that void. And so this interaction between the upper class gentry who sometimes produced the music and these lower class gypsies who often and most often played it became known as this style hongrois. And it became fascinating to the European composers of the time, the mainstream composers like Haydn, and they often evoked it in their pieces for exotic ideas. And for a little while around the turn of the 19th century, there was a period where one was going out and one was coming in, and you found the Turkish and the Hungarian styles juxtaposed right next to each other in the same piece. And an example of that is in Haydn's G major trio called the Gypsy Trio because of its last movement, which is called the Rondo a Hongroise. And the first of the ostensibly Hungarian-style interludes is really much more in the outgoing Turkish style. I'll play you a bit, and you'll hear those jangling percussive effects and those insistent rhythms and those repeated notes, all of which I think are a bit redolent of the sound of that Janissary music that we heard in the Mozart opera. move through this interlude, the music darkens considerably. It goes into a minor mode, and the bouncy, jaunty cello part suddenly becomes a sustained drone, like a gypsy bagpipe. In those days, apparently, gypsies played bagpipes. And also, there are all kinds of rhythmic configurations which we will shortly discover are very characteristic of this style hongrois. This piece was written in, I believe, 1795, about 4 years after Mozart died. And very soon after that, the younger generation of composers, such as Johann Nepomuk Hummel, who was a student of Mozart, and I understand he enjoyed a great success here last week at the festival, he began to embrace this new-fangled Hungarian gypsy style, which was perhaps appropriate for him because he was actually from what is now Bratislava. He was from the outlying areas of the Hungarian Empire at that time. And to give you an example, in 1808, he wrote a piece of music which is 7 Hungarian-style dances, and I'll play you a bit of the 4th in that series, and you can now really hear the Hungarian atmosphere in this. You can taste the paprika in the style of this music making. Very Hungarian sounding now. And the question is, what are the characteristics of the style hongrois? What specifically comprises this Hungarian style? First, there was this very conscious effort on the part of the composers to imitate the sounds of the instrument most prominent in the gypsy bands of the day. And in those days, as in these days, the most prominent instrument was the gypsy fiddle. And the most prominent gypsy fiddler around the turn of the 19th century was Bihari János, who was known at that time as the Napoleon of the fiddle, and you can see why from this imperious-looking portrait of the man. And apparently he was just an astonishing fiddler and was admired universally. Beethoven thought he was great. Liszt apparently thought he was great, so much that he waxed poetic. He said, "The tones sung by his magic violin flow on our enchanted ears like the tears." I don't know how the tears wind up on the ears, but in any event, he wrote a lot of music, some of which has come down to us today, and it has this Hungarian gypsy flavor to it. I'll play you an excerpt from the piece he wrote called Verbunkos. Proud and defiant people. Now, another instrument that was very much a part of gypsy bands in those days as it is today is the cimbalom, which is this hybrid instrument. It's part piano, it's part hammer dulcimer. And it was also an instrument that was admired by Liszt, and he spoke admiringly about the people who played it. He said, "The cimbalom player supplies the rhythm and indicates the acceleration or slackening of time and also the degree of movement. He manipulates the instrument with singular agility as if it were a sleight of hand performance. The little wooden hammers with which he travels over the strings of this primitive piano perform the duty that we assign to ivory keys." Liszt loved the sound of this instrument, and he often represents it in his 19 Hungarian Rhapsodies. We hear it very clearly at the beginning of Rhapsody number 11. Those little bird chirps that you hear at the end on that perfect fourth, mi, la, mi. That's another intervallic indicator of the style Hongrois. It has a name, it's called the Kuruk fourth. It gets its name from the Kuruk warriors who accompanied Rákóczi Ferenc on an early revolt against Austrian Habsburg rule. And we hear them all over the place in the Rákóczi March. Another intervallic indicator of the style Hongrois we heard at the beginning of that passage, which is the augmented second, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do, re, mi, that exotic interval that we know from the harmonic minor scale. And in the gypsy scale, there are two of them, between the third and the fourth, and the sixth and the seventh degrees of the scale. Which is a very almost an Arabic quality of sound. The Arabic scale also has two augmented seconds put in different places, but in the music of 19th century composers, when you hear that augmented second, as we did in that piece by Hummel that I played for you, it's a sure indicator that we have just crossed the border into Hungarian gypsy territory. And as I mentioned when I played that Hummel piece for you, there are all kinds of rhythmic indicators of the style Hongrois as well. I will name a few for you. One of the most characteristic is called the spandi, which is two sustained notes in the middle of an otherwise forward-flowing musical passage. It's like the musicians have suddenly pulled back on the reins of an otherwise forward cantering melody. We hear them in the exposition of the great cello quintet by Schubert all over the place. We also hear them in the development section of that first movement. I played for you, we also hear lots of dotted rhythms, and dotted rhythms in conjunction with other intervallic indicators of the style Hongrois are very characteristic of this style of music making, as are the reverse of that, which is the short, long rhythm, the baba, because that sound is very much associated with the sound of the Hungarian language, which so many of the words begin with that short, long syllabic structure. And any rhythmic configuration that incorporates that is very much an indicator of this style of music. For instance, there's a kind of configuration called the choreamnus, which is long, short, short, long, long, short, short, long. Of Liszt. And another ubiquitous Hungarian-style rhythm is the Hallgató rhythm, which means limping because it goes short, long, short, short, long, short. That again from the Schubert cello quintet, the last movement. And there's one other rhythmic configuration I will tell you about, which is called the bo-katso rhythm. And it is often heard in conjunction with a particular set of intervals and grace notes around the cadence points of music of this kind, so often that Liszt referred to it as the Magyar cadence. easier to play for you than to describe, but I think if you know this kind of music, you'll recognize it when you hear it. You hear that be-dum-yum-ba-dum everywhere in this kind of music. And apparently it was supposed to represent the sound of the clicking of the ankle spurs of the heroic Hussar cavalrymen. And this association with military men and military recruiting rituals is also very important as an aspect of the origin of this style of music making. Apparently, in the early 18th century, there was a style called the Verbunkos recruiting dance. And the idea was that impressively clad Hungarian soldiers would march or ride into small Hungarian villages. They would rally the young men from the fields. They would teach them these dances. And in combination with liberal doses of alcohol, apparently this was a very effective way of convincing people that the military was the life for them. And I was looking for a contemporaneous description of this process, and I found, I think, a pretty good one by a Benedictine monk whose name was Gregor Tsutzor, and I will read you a couple of paragraphs of it, and you can look at an image of this Verbunkos dance in progress. He writes, "We stand in the market square of a small town in which peasants from the surrounding country gather. The soldiers arrive, accompanied by a crowd mostly of village youngsters. The corporal stands out straight away with his bearing, an official facial expression colored by some sauciness and a measured light step are his conspicuous features. He moves his feet pointedly and stands as something of an example before the young men because he is the dancing master directing the group, while the young lads surround him with dashing lightness, clicking their ankle spurs and clapping, ornamenting and sharpening their steps. The young men stand around in a circle with the corporal in the center and with the gypsy band playing a new tune. The recruiting begins." Looks like fun. Makes you want to go off and join the army. This Verbunkos dance began slowly. It got faster and faster and more fiery. The opening section was called the Lasciu section, which means slow. The fast section was called Frisch. And at the beginning of the slow section, there was an improvisatory section, which was called the Hallgató style. And it's a very recognizable style if you know Hungarian gypsy bands and their style of playing. It's, I think you can imagine the corporals and the recruiting officers walking around impressively, jangling their spurs, taking the measure of these young people that they're about to recruit into the army. Here's a contemporary example of the style. Sounds familiar because I think that this style of Hallgató playing hasn't really changed in its essence in the last couple of centuries, and I gleaned that from pieces composed by composers such as Haydn in 1788. He wrote a stylized but I think recognizable version of this Hallgató section in his second Opus 54 string quartet. that more than 100 years later, in 1891, Brahms was still interested in evoking this Hallgató style. We hear it clearly in the second movement of his great quintet for clarinet and strings. These words, Verbunkos, gypsy, Hungarian, they all were indicators of this style of music making. And these Verbunkos winds blew west across the Hungarian border into Vienna and beyond. And they were often imitated for exotic effect by composers such as Haydn and Brahms and Schubert and others. And of course, their style of music making blew eastward across the Hungarian border into Hungary and influenced all of them the classical composers of Hungary at that time. And in the 19th century, undoubtedly the greatest of the Hungarian composers was Liszt Ferenc. And yet he was a special case because although he was born in Hungary, he left early and he spoke no Hungarian. The upper class intelligentsia often spoke German, and he left so early that he really never learned to speak Hungarian at all well. And he became a touring virtuoso and he settled in France and he spoke French. And so from the perspective of the nobility and the upper gentry, he was not an apt representative early in his life for this emblem of the Hungarian persona. The composer who was more representative to them at that time was Erkel Ferenc, who was a very fine composer. He is known as the composer of the Hungarian national anthem, and was also a composer of many operas, some of which still reside in the Hungarian heart today. Particularly, there was one called Bach-Ban, and it is very popular because it used a 13th century revolt against infiltrators, conspirators from foreign lands as an allegory for the 18th century desire to free themselves from Austrian Habsburg rule. And so when Erkel writes in a more international style, which is to say the prevailing Italian/Verdian style of opera making, he uses it to evoke the villainous character of these foreign infiltrators. Here is a mustache twirling villain for you. Verdi in that style. Now, when he wants to evoke the pure, unsullied spirit of the hero Bach-Ban and his wife Melinda, he uses these Verbunkos stylings, which is to say the dotted rhythms, the inverted dotted rhythms, the short longs, the augmented seconds, all of that to make it sound very Hungarian. It's clear why a composer like Erkel would use this style, because he is representing the spirit of Hungary. Perhaps less clear why Haydn and Brahms and Schubert would use it beyond simple exoticism. But I think that there was a set of connotations with the Hungarian Romani people, which in one way or another they were trying to evoke. As I said about the Turks, the same was about the European attitudes towards the Romani. They were under suspicion. They were not understood. They were outsiders. They were considered to be godless baby stealers, and they were just subject to terrible persecution. And the women were all considered to be sort of Carmen-like sirens leading European gentlemen to webs of moral degradation and all that. But there was this other side to the gypsy persona, which was this alluring side to Europeans. I think Europeans who thought of themselves perhaps as prisoners of conventional morality and conventions, mores of European society, they envied what they saw as this life of unbridled sensuality and emotional excess and hedonism. And a composer like Schubert, of course, was a hedonistic bohemian character. And in 1822, he discovered that he had contracted syphilis. And this, in 1822, was tantamount to a death sentence because there was no way that you could treat it. There were no antibiotics. And what medications that they had to treat it were laced with mercury, and they were toxic themselves. And so from this point in his life, he became aware of the fact that he had this sort of Damocles hanging above him, and he spiraled downward over the last 5 years of his life. And interestingly, at just about that same time, I think the following year of 1823, he wrote his first of many pieces that incorporate these style Hongrois stylings. This one in his Moment Musical, the F minor movement, which has all of these qualities that we have spoken about. And from this point in his life, the last 5 years, until he died in 1828, he used this style of music making more and more prominently in at least 13 major pieces that he wrote. We hear it in the last movement of his octet for winds and strings. In the last movement, at the beginning, there's a lot of gypsy violin playing in that stormy section in the introduction. In the Ninth Symphony, there's this beautiful oboe solo, yum, ba-dum, 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 which has those dotted rhythms and the character of the gypsy band. We hear it everywhere in the last piece that he wrote, this beautiful cello quintet that we've heard examples of. And as he got closer and closer to the end, he used it more and more, so that in the last year of his life, from the fall of 1827 until the fall of 1828, he used it in at least 5 major pieces. I'll play you a few examples of music from that last year of his life. Musicologists speculate that his increasing use of the style Hongrois as he began to see his life draining out and became more and more of this sort of Damocles hanging above him was not a coincidence, and that in some way it was a coded reference to his identification with the defiant, hedonistic, laughing in the face of destiny attitudes that he saw among the gypsy musicians who played in these cafes that he frequented during the evenings, and that in some way he identified with their outsider status and this notion that they were paid to provide merriment to the very people who were their tormentors. And in the case of Liszt, we see a similar, I think, identification with this outsider status, because as I mentioned earlier, he was Hungarian by birth, but he was an outsider after he left and not entirely respected by the Hungarians early in his life. He was a peripatetic virtuoso like the gypsies, and also he led this life of unbridled sensuality and defiance of conventional norms. And so in many ways he really did identify with these gypsy stereotypes. So much so that in 1859 he wrote a book which was called The Gypsies and Their Music in Hungary. It's a 450-page book on Hungarian music as it is derived from the gypsies. And in fact, he was wrong. I mean, the Hungarian music is not entirely derived from the gypsies, and it managed to offend the upper classes who were, they could accept the fact that it was the gypsies who were playing this music most often. They didn't want to relinquish ownership of the music itself, and so they were not happy about it. But this was how he felt about it, and it's an interesting book. I've read portions of it, and although he is extolling the gypsies as these exemplars of Hungarianness, he also looks down on them. He has these prevailing racist attitudes that everybody else had at the time, and yet there is this other side of the coin, this allure that they had for him. And he writes in his book, of all the languages which it has been given to man to understand and make of, music is the only one which the gypsy has loved. And of all the sentiments which the gypsy has sought to express in it, pain and pride are the most remarkable. And he expresses that directly in the performance instructions to his 7th Hungarian Rhapsody, in which he writes, to be played in the haughty and melancholy style of gypsies. Now, as Liszt got older, from about the 1860s onward, he began to spend more and more time in his native Hungary, in Budapest in particular, where he was invited to teach at the conservatory. After he died, they named him after it. He became a hero there. And his music continued to have these Hungarian characteristics, but the style Hongrois, this defiance and melancholy and all of these threatening elements began to ebb away, because he had lived long enough to see this style begin to lose its threat and become more of a kind of entertainment music, kind of exotic, commercialized music. And we see that same progression in Brahms and his use of the style Hongrois. He first encountered it in an active way when he was 20 years old and left Hamburg in the company of this young gentleman whose name was Edward Reményi, who was a very fine violinist and was from Hungary, and liked to pepper his recitals with these Hungarian gypsy-style bonbons. And so Brahms developed a taste for the music, and he used it often in his larger works, particularly in these fiery last movements of his chamber music and his large large concertos, such as the G minor piano quartet. The last movement has this gypsy swagger to it, and the violin concerto, which he wrote for his friend Joachim, has that yum, bum, 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 beep, bum, 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 that gypsy quality to it. But the style of writing that we most associate Brahms' use of the style Hongrois with was to be found in these 21 Hungarian dances that he wrote in 2 books between 1869 and 1880. And these are really parlor music. They were very popular. If you were a composer at that time and you wanted to make a lot of money, you wrote this kind of music because people liked to play it and they bought your music. And so when he had finished the last set, the last book of his 2nd book of Hungarian dances, he packaged them up and he sent them off to his friend and confidant Elizabeth von Herzogenberg. They were very close, and she had been a student of his and was apparently a very good pianist, and so he asked her for her response, and she responded in this typically effusive and flirtatious style. She said, "Delicious as the earlier ones were, I hardly think that you hit off the indescribable and unique character of a Hungarian band so miraculously then as now. This medley of twirls and grace notes, this jingling, whistling, gurgling clatter, is all reproduced in such a way that the piano ceases to be a piano and one is carried straight away into the midst of the fiddlers." And you can hear all of that in the end of the 18th in this set. So you can hear clearly that jingling, whistling, gurgling clatter of which he spoke. And you can also hear this vernacular charm, but what we don't really hear anymore is that dark undercurrent, that element of threat and defiance and unbridled sensuality, because once again, this style had become sanitized in some basic way. It was now commercial music, it was now entertainment. And as I mentioned, this piece was written around 1880. The following year, 1881, Béla Bartók was born. And for him, this whole style hongrois really had nothing to do with the Hungarian soul. He grew to dislike it, and in the early years of the 20th century, he delivered this withering comment on the style hongrois and gypsy bands in general. He said, "The music that is nowadays played for money by urban gypsy bands is nothing but popular art music of recent origin. When it is represented as being something more than music of a lower order destined to gratify undeveloped musical tastes, we must raise our voices in solemn protest." So I will let Bartók glower down on you disapprovingly as you chew on that statement. And when we come back from our 10-minute break, we will talk about Bartók and his development of this new language based on folk music in the 20th century. So have a good break. See you soon.